Hello, everyone. Good morning if you are near me on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you near the East Coast. My name is Branden. I am an instructor with LSATMax. I teach both LSAT preparation and bar exam preparation. I want to thank you for coming out and joining us today. We're going to be talking about how you can fill your time between now and law school in a way that is useful. There is a whole lot that you can do to prepare yourself for law school, and we'll talk about all that stuff in detail. A few things before we get started. A few things to mention as we get started. First of all, we have a great podcast that is useful for people who are taking the LSAT, applying to law school. A link has just popped up in the chat. It's called The Legal Level. I host that podcast with another instructor, Yelena. We just recently interviewed Kath Path, who is a YouTuber who scored in the 170s on the LSAT using TestMax. That podcast came out yesterday, so hopefully you can check that out. Some of the older episodes will have useful information on the LSAT law school and beyond as well. So be sure to check that out. One more thing before we get started. This presentation, just like all of our presentations, is one that invites participation. So if you have questions or comments as we move through today's presentation, please feel free to jump in. There are a couple of ways you can do that. I know we've all been in Zoom school for the last year, so all of this stuff I'm sure you know, but I'll just point it out. At the bottom of your Zoom window, there's a couple of different ways that you can participate. So there's a chat box. I'll try to keep an eye on it. If you want to type questions or comments into the chat box, I'll try to answer them as they come in. Sometimes in a larger presentation, the chat box goes by a little too fast for me to catch it. But Katie, our events manager, is also monitoring the chat, and she can answer questions as well. So feel free to jump in there. You can also raise your hand and talk to everybody just like I'm talking to everybody right now. There's also a Q&A box. I'm happy to answer questions at the end of today's presentation. So if you have a question that's not directly on the topic that we're talking about at that moment in the presentation, just feel free to drop those questions into the Q&A box and I will answer them at the end of today's presentation. I think that's all of the business we need to get out of the way. So let me share my screen with you and we can talk about what you need to do between now and when you set your foot first in your dream law school. All righty. So how to prepare for law school other than the LSAT. Because we are largely an LSAT prep company, I will talk about the LSAT for just a moment when we're talking about applying to law schools. But there is a lot you can do aside from racking your brains about questions of logic. So this is going to be kind of the three main topics for today's presentation. All of you, I'm guessing, are here because you are interested in going to law school. And you will be at different steps in that process. So some of you are still undergrads and you're thinking and preparing. Maybe you haven't taken the LSAT yet. Maybe you haven't researched law school yet. Some of you may have already applied to law schools. Maybe you're on a wait list. But this is going to cover everything between when you first start to think about law school to when you are in the door at law school. So here's what I mean by that. The three things that you should be thinking about generally are, especially before you have applied, building a resume that law schools will like to look at. Obviously, in order to go to law school, you must apply. So what steps does that require? And then finally, and this is what I think people unfortunately spend the least time thinking about, but it's actually very important, how do you prepare for the actual work of law school? A lot of people go to law school with very little understanding of what the law looks like, what the practice of law is like. If you are getting your information from television, either from, I don't know, Suits or Boston Legal or Law and Order, then you may have a skewed vision of what the law looks like. And so understanding what you are getting yourself into, I think, is a huge part of preparing for law school. So with that said, I think the best way to start out is to just think about what law school looks like, and then we can work backward from there. So what are you preparing for? Well, what you're preparing for is your 1L year. I'll talk a little bit about the stuff that comes beyond your first year of law school. But generally, the best preparation for the stuff that comes after, like the next few years of law school, jobs, outside of your law school. All of those are things that your 1L year is at least supposed to prepare you for. So what we're going to talk about mostly is what that first year looks like. That first year can be very difficult. It can be confusing. I remember, so I went to UCLA School of Law. I graduated in 2011. And I remember in my first week of law school being in my civil procedure class, and my professor and a woman in my class, one of the other students who was in my section, were having a conversation. And I remember thinking, I have no idea what they're talking about, and I must be in the wrong place. I don't know that there's necessarily anything I could have done to prepare for that moment, but I do feel like I could have had a better idea of what law school looked like. So law school, at least as far as the classes go, your 1L year, you don't have a lot of choice over what it is you're doing. And in fact, when I say you don't have a lot of choice, what I mean is you have no choice. Your first year generally is already laid out for you before you set foot in the door. And the way law school generally works, if you're going to full-time, daytime law school, it takes 3 years. And your first year is very structured. So it's structured in terms of what you're learning, the classes you take, but it's also structured in terms of whom you're studying with and whom you're taking classes with. So you will be placed into a section. Most law schools operate on the principle that small groups of people who take all the same classes together and study together can help one another out in learning the ropes of law school. So my section, I think, was maybe 10 or 11 people, something like that. And we took all the same classes together. We would take classes with other sections. It's not like a class would just be our section, but we would always be with that same core of people. It makes a lot of sense, you know, especially just kind of the social aspect of it. It makes sense because people often come from, you know, far away. They don't have friends. And so it's a good way to get people comfortable with each other. So I think it's important that way, but it's also important just because learning the law is weird. If you have studied for the LSAT, you've already started to get a taste of this, which is lawyers have a very different mode of thinking. And once you learn that mode of thinking, the next couple of years of law school become, if not easy, then straightforward, because you're taking that mode of thinking and you're just applying it to new subjects. But your 1L year is where you're learning that mode of thinking. And so you will be placed with a bunch of other people to learn that mode of thinking. As you are taking these classes, they break down into, broadly speaking, 2 topics or 2 areas. So there are what are known as doctrinal classes. These are the ones where you learn the substance of the law. These tend to be semester-long classes, or at least when I took them, they were semester-long. And this is where you're learning the very common areas of law. These are the areas of law that even if you're taking other classes, the principles that you learn in these areas of law will apply to those other classes. You will not take all of these in one semester. Generally, you'll have like 3 doctrinal classes per semester. These are the ones basically every law school teaches. What is also important about these, and I know this is way down the road, but we are talking about preparation, so it's good to think about it. The bar exam, depending upon the state that you take it in, will have some different topics, but all bar exams test a core of the same topics. And all of these things down here, these guys are all on the bar exam. Civil procedure, criminal law, torts, contracts, property, constitutional law. It does not matter what bar exam you take, you will have to understand those topics. So all of that is to say that as you are taking these topics, it's, you know, obviously important to learn them, but it's important to know that those topics are coming back with a vengeance if you want to be a lawyer. So what are each of these? Some of these you will have heard of. I'm sure you have heard of criminal law. I don't have to explain that, but some of them may be a little bit removed from view for people who are not part of the legal industry. So the class that I was talking about that I found confusing, although it was not the most confusing, was civil procedure. And this is the law about the law. It's about how you file a lawsuit. It's about what you can do in the courtroom, although evidence has a lot to do with that as well. So I'm getting a question from Emily. Do you take constitutional law your second year, if not the first? So I will get there, yes. We had constitutional law in our second year. It was a 1-semester class, but it was a required class. A lot of schools will teach constitutional law in your first year. So it's kind of different from school to school. It's not like these others where these are always taught to everyone else every time. But it is, again, a topic that is like other areas of law keep coming back to constitutional law. And so it's another one of those foundational areas that it's important to understand eventually, and also for the bar exam. So civil procedure, like I was saying, is the law about the law. And it's removed from sight. So you'll kind of get some experience with it if you're watching trials on TV, but mostly what you're getting is experience with evidence law when people are objecting and stuff like that. And that's not civil procedure. That's a different area of law. But civil procedure just governs how lawsuits work, how courts work, things like that, which is important. Criminal law, again, we all have, if not real life experience with this, then we know what it is. This is where if you commit a crime, you get arrested, and then a district attorney will prosecute you. Torts is a very important area of law, and it's something that you probably have some idea about if you ever see like personal injury attorneys. Well, those people deal with torts. And a tort is just when one person has in some way injured another person. That may be a physical injury, but it can also be a financial injury. If you take money from somebody, that can be a tort as well. And this is where one party sues another party, plaintiff and defendant. And this is a very big common area of law, just people suing each other. So torts is important. It's important especially for litigators. That's a lot of what litigators tend to do, is to work with torts. Contracts, again, we know what contracts are, so there's not too much to explain there. This is the thing that you just click I agree on when it pops up. And I don't know, you're trying to update an app or something, and it commits you to something that you didn't want to. But there are actually people out there who write those contracts, who read those contracts, and there are principles that underlie them. And then there's property. This mostly has to do with real property, with land, and the stuff that you build on land, although property classes generally have at least a part on movable property, personal property. Property law is really weird. And the reason that it's really weird is that it's archaic. So we're going to talk about preparing for stuff down the road, but what you're going to find with property law that just blew my mind that I did not realize is that property law was basically invented after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, when I think it was King Richard divided up his lands among his barons, among the nobles, and all of the principles of property law derived from that event. And it's really weird and archaic, and there are a lot of rules that should not be around anymore 1,000 years later, but they are still around. So I'm getting a question, what would crypto fall under? Ooh, I would think, I mean, to the extent that you're actually going to study crypto, like cryptocurrencies in law school, that would probably be like in a securities class or maybe a business law class. I don't think you would get too much into it here. I mean, property principles apply because it is something that you would own. And so there is an ownership thing going on there, but I don't think you would learn much about crypto there. I would think you would need to probably take a specialized class. And I'm sure, you know, lots of law schools are probably exploring this area. So you should definitely, if you're interested in crypto, you should, you know, reach out to law schools and ask them, are they, you know, is there a professor who's working on that? That could actually be a good, you know, kind of intro. So I would just say that, but crypto, I don't think would fall squarely under any of these. Yeah, so property law is weird. Just prepare yourself. And as we're talking about preparing, you might want to just kind of look at that ancient history of property law. It is in some ways kind of fascinating, and there are some bloody episodes to it. But it's a little bit weird, but that's what you're getting yourself into. And then there's constitutional law. So constitutional law generally has to do with what is in the US Constitution. But laws must pass constitutional muster. And so constitutional law is very broad because it is a great way for people to push back against what the government is doing, whether it's the federal government or the state government. Those constitutional rights, your right to free speech, your right to bear arms, you know, your right against search and seizure, your right to a speedy trial, all of those are things that you can assert against the state government, even if you're not specifically talking about constitutional law. So constitutional law is fascinating, and all of the other areas of law, constitutional law is kind of hovering over them, especially when it comes to government action. So those are the doctrinal courses. And then you will also have, and it's usually a year-long course, you'll have at least one practical course. And this is where you learn to do the work of being a lawyer. So law school is a professional school. You're going to go out there, you're going to work probably at a firm, and you're going to create products that people pay for. They're not like things that you manufacture, they're intellectual type products, filing motions, things like that. But it is a profession. And so there are standards that go along with that profession. And legal research and writing teaches you how to do, I don't want to say the most basic, but kind of the foundational stuff of being a lawyer. So especially when you start out your legal career, you're probably not going to spend a lot of time in front of a judge or a jury, having those explosive moments like you see on television shows. And even when you get later into your career, law does not look like the exciting parts of law shows for the most part. Instead, a lot of it is you researching issues. You use Westlaw and LexisNexis primarily. Those are databases that have case law and statutes from not just all over the country, but all over the world. And then writing is important. A lot of what lawyers do, especially well into their careers, is written. So again, what you'll see on TV as you're watching a legal show is somebody who's arguing a motion in front of a judge. So maybe in a criminal law show, you're watching somebody, I don't know, argue a motion to suppress the murder weapon. Well, that happens. People do go and argue motions in front of a judge in court. But usually that only happens after the judge has read the motions that you write, so written motions. And a lot of times judges will make decisions, what they call on the papers, where even if there might be an opportunity for oral argument, the judge decides it's not necessary. And so a lot of what you are doing is writing. And lawyers write in a very particular way. Again, it's a product rather than, extemporaneous writing. And so it's important to learn those principles. Basically, you're going to learn to write two products when you are in this legal research and writing class. And so I'll just explain what those products are. One is a memo, generally an internal memo. And this is where you will write an analysis of the law that is objective, where you're both writing about, so it's an issue, maybe your client wants you to bring a particular motion. And you have to decide whether or not you have a good legal basis for bringing this motion. So what you do initially, and often this is assigned by somebody who's higher up in a law firm to somebody who's, a new associate, is that you do a bunch of research. So you find out what is the status of the law on this issue from Lexis and Westlaw. And then you write a memo where you're objective, where you say, maybe, yes, I think we should bring this motion. Or maybe you say, no, it's actually a bad idea to bring this motion. We're likely to lose, or we're going to be, doing something that the court doesn't like in order to bring this motion. So that is objective. It's circulated in the law firm. It does not make it outside the law firm. But there are also briefs that you write. And briefs, when I was talking about arguing a motion, that's the argument that you write out and you submit to the court. And you also give a copy to opposing counsel. And there you're not being objective. Instead, you've already made the decision to go ahead with this motion. And so you are making your best arguments for your position and your best arguments against the opposing position. But those are the two main products that you will learn to write in your legal research and writing class. And they are the two main products that lawyers get paid to write. Although lawyers get paid to write other things as well. So that's what your first year will look like in terms of classes. So that's what you're preparing for. We'll talk about certain ways to, hit the ground running with this stuff in a little bit, but I think that's a good place to start. There are also lots of extracurricular activities. In your first year, you will have probably less bandwidth to participate in these extracurricular activities than you will in years 2 and 3. A lot of times there's a limit on what you can do as a 1L. Like for instance, most law schools will make you promise not to work during your 1L year because it can take a lot of time to keep up with your work. But these are some activities that you may participate in. These tend to be voluntary, so you should, obviously participate in the ones that you are interested in. But knowing about these activities, when I get to talking about making your application, is going to be very helpful. Because the more you can tailor your application to a particular school and to show them that your experience is really relevant to whatever projects they have going on at that school, the better. So if you know of these activities and you can talk about how you would contribute to them, especially in your personal statement, that can be very persuasive to a law school. This is a non-exhaustive list. Other law schools besides the one I went to probably have other things going on, but these are the things that you can participate in. So student groups, there are all sorts of student groups on campus. You know, these can be things like people who are interested in a particular area of law, like the patent law student group. Or it can be, you know, for a certain identity, like I was part of the Jewish Law Students Association at UCLA, things like that. Just like you do in undergrad, those same kinds of groups exist generally in law school. Clinics are where you do some of the work of being a lawyer. Sometimes these are classes, like you can take clinical classes, but there are also clinics where you're learning about the law by helping people. So when I was at UCLA, I participated in a couple of clinics. One was called El Centro, and we would go to juvenile hall prison locations and work with juvenile prisoners, both on their legal claims and also, you know, making sure that they were taken care of at these places. So that was a really cool experience. I also participated in the Innocence Project, which is where you review old cases. And if it seems like somebody might have been wrongfully convicted, then you help them file appeals and get out of jail. So that was also very interesting. If you're interested in a particular area of law, like I was talking about, reaching out to a law school and seeing if there's anybody who's working on that area of law you're interested in. So again, if you're interested, for instance, in crypto, then reach out. There might be a professor who is working on an article or doing some other work in that area. And just like undergraduate professors have research assistants, law professors have research assistants as well. Again, you might have to wait until your second year to do this. You may not have the bandwidth to do it your first year, but that's a great way to get your foot in the door. There's mock trial, which most people know about. This is where you put on a fake trial in front of a fake judge and a fake jury, and that fake jury will decide. So if you have mock trial experience as an undergrad, that's very relevant. There's also moot court. People are a little bit less familiar with moot court. It is related to mock trial, but it's just a fake appellate, well, not a fake appellate trial, but fake appellate hearings rather than a fake trial. And so appeals are like, the appeals that people know the most about are the Supreme Court. That's where a bank of judges who sits higher up in the food chain than the people who run the trials decide whether or not the issues were decided correctly in the lower courts. Lots of lawyers do appellate law. Some of them do appellate law exclusively. And so that's another great way to participate and to learn about, you know, a really interesting area of law. It tends to be, I guess I would say, a little bit more intellectual than mock trial, because you're arguing ostensibly to a bank of judges rather than to a jury. But there are other things that you will be doing outside of class. Journals. So schools very often have their own journal. When I was at UCLA Law, there was the UCLA Law Review, but there are also often journals that are on specific issues. So like I was saying, patent law, the law of inventions, I remember there was JOLT, the Journal of Law and Technology. And generally the way this works is you start in your first year when you're mostly like editing and checking citations on articles that might be submitted by a professor, often from another school. But then eventually, as you get farther into the process, you may write your own articles that show up in the journal, which can be exciting. And then you should prepare for the fact that by the end of your first year, you should hopefully have a job going into the summer after your first year of law school. Most law schools have on-campus interview programs. I know these have been modified during the coronavirus pandemic. Hopefully next year they will get closer to normal, although I'm guessing the remote interviewing is probably going to stick around. But law schools are very focused on helping students turn their law degree, or at least good law schools are focused on helping law schools law students turn their law degree into a job. And that starts very early on. You know, you'll have a job between your first and second year, you'll have a job between your second and third year. You can kind of be a little more open-ended and explore in that job between your first and second year. The job between your second and third year ideally is one that will lead to a job offer after you get out of law school. So I'm getting a question, if a school doesn't currently have a student group I'm interested in joining, can I talk about how I want to start a chapter of a particular student group? So I'm confused as to whether or not this question is about at the school, so the school you're applying to, I think, if that's what you're talking about, rather than you want to be in a student group at your undergraduate institution currently. So can you talk about how you would want to start a chapter, that particular student group? I would say yes, and especially if you have experience with that particular type of student group as an undergraduate, then I think that's actually a great foot in the door. So obviously you don't want to say, you know, your law school is lacking, but if you can find some way to contribute in a unique way, that is actually catnip for law schools. So I'm going to talk about crafting a personal statement, but the personal statement, kind of the main argument that you're making, is that you are going to bring a unique set of experiences that they would not get from another student. And if you have an idea of a kind of student group that you want to create, then I think that shows initiative, and it also shows that you're irreplaceable. So I would say yes, I think it would be a good idea to talk about that, but I would talk about it just in a positive manner, by which I mean like less on you should have this kind of student group rather than I'm excited to bring my experiences here and share them in this format. So that's what law school looks like. Now we can talk about how to prepare for it. And there are a couple of different areas like we were talking about. But first, let's talk about building your resume. So what's awesome about law school and applying to law school is that law schools do not expect a like standard history like other types of schools do. So for instance, if you're applying to med schools are pretty standard about what they want to see from students. You need to have taken, you know, a certain set of classes. You need to take the MCAT. With law school, you have to take the LSAT, but law schools are not looking for somebody who has training in the law already. Instead, they expect to bring in people who have all sorts of different experiences. Some of those may be like law relevant experiences. Some of them won't be entirely law relevant, but they're looking to take people who know nothing about the law and turn them into a lawyer in 3 years. So I'm getting this question: how do I build a resume if I have an engineering background with 30 years of experience? I'm not trying to be glib by answering it this way, but I would say that you have already built a resume. If you have 30 years of engineering experience, then what that says to me is that you are positioned in a very prime way to be a patent lawyer. So I would think you would talk about that experience. You can certainly do some of these other things that we're talking about, but that actually sounds great to me. And again, you know, law school is looking for people with different experiences to throw in the mix together. If you are a non-traditional student with 30 years of engineering experience, then I think that makes you a standout. So again, I don't want to be glib and not answer your question, but I think you are already well ahead of the game. It's not like other schools where they're like, oh, you know, you didn't go to law school immediately. Well, you know, don't come to law school. Does it help? So I'm getting this question: does it help to have experience as a legal assistant paralegal at a law firm before law school? I do think it helps, but I don't think it's required in that, well, let me put it this way. I think it helps more. I think it looks good on your resume. So I think that's great. But I think it helps more in helping you understand what the law is like than it necessarily is like the experience that law schools are looking for. Law schools like that experience, but they like lots of other types of experience as well. So I do think it's a good idea to do that stuff, but mostly for your own understanding. So if you are an undergraduate, then you can participate in law-related student groups. So this can be things like Phi Alpha Delta. Lots of schools have a chapter of Phi Alpha Delta, which is a legal fraternity. You can do mock trial at lots of schools. You can do, we're going to talk about it a little bit, but things like speech and debate. Those are very useful skills to have. And if law schools see that you have speech and debate on your academic record, that's helpful. So law-related student groups are good, but other student groups are good as well. What law schools want to see is that you have an idea of what is important to you, what fires you up, and that can be the motivator for a law school and a legal career. So even if your student group experience is not specifically on the law, but let's say You're a member of several different groups that advocate for social justice. Even if none of those are you doing like law work, it is still relevant. And it's still something that you can talk about turning into, the fire in your belly and the important thing that you want to do as a lawyer. Lots of people go to law school, to respond to things that they have seen or that they have experienced. And so those things, other student groups, I think are just as good. Participating in student government, just like undergraduate schools will have, president, things like that. The same thing is true at law school. So your law school class will have a president. So if you have student government experience, then you can talk about in your personal statement, especially bringing that student government experience along with you. There are also outside volunteer opportunities, and you don't have to be at a school to do this. And again, feel free to volunteer in what you want to volunteer in. It's nice to have some legal experience, but law schools want to see that you're active, that you're passionate, that you have a strong moral compass. And if you are showing those things with your volunteering, it does not have to be law school related. Like I was talking about, mock trial is a good way to do it. There are also internships and externships. And again, I think you can go about these broadly. You can work in a law firm, you can do a legal related one, but it is not necessary in order for it to be a useful piece of your application package. Just very broadly, there are kind of three sectors when it comes to where lawyers work. I think the more, as you are thinking about law school, the more you can think about what your career as a lawyer is going to look like, the better. And so I would recommend just trying to think through, well, what industry do I want to work in? What area of law, what subject matter am I interested in? So for instance, if you were interested in being an environmental attorney, well, you could go work for a private firm. Some of those defend polluters against environmental claims. So that may be something you want to do, that may not. That's probably the way to make the most money outside of law school, is to go to one of those private firms. But that same area, you can work in government or you can work in public interest. So for instance, if you're interested in environmental law, you could work for the EPA. That's the federal agency that oversees the environment, but there are also state agencies. So like in California, you may have never heard of this, but there's an agency called the Department of Toxic Substances Control, and they have lots of environmental lawyers there as well. And then there are public interest groups. These tend to be groups that are private, but they operate off of charitable donations. And then they take on cases that you can't make a bunch of money taking on. So again, with an environmental attorney, there might be like a class action lawsuit about some particular, polluting installation. Like for instance, and I don't want to get into the politics of it, but for several years, there's been the Keystone Pipeline, which is slated to bring, I think, oil from Canada to the US. But people have been fighting against that. And so if that's something that you want to fight against, you might join one of these public interest firms. Many of them in all of these are hiring interns and externs. And so just think about it. And then finally, like I was saying, research assistant is a very common thing you do in law school. So if you're interested in doing that there, then you can be a research assistant as an undergrad. Lots of professors use undergraduate research assistants, and it looks great on your resume. Again, that is a non-exhaustive list. Think about what you want to do as a lawyer, and then set yourself up for that career as much as you can. So your application, we won't talk about this a lot because this is kind of the piece of this presentation that has been explained in other presentations elsewhere. But obviously, if you're going to go to law school, you must submit complete applications. And just so you know what you have ahead of you, it's important to, especially with some of these things, start early. So just about every school, and by every school, I mean every ABA accredited law school, there are about 200 law schools in this country that have an accreditation from the American Bar Association. You can be confident that you're getting a good legal education at one of those schools and that you will be prepared for things like the bar exam. There are other schools that are not ABA accredited, and I think you have to be careful about those. If you're thinking about one of those schools, then try to find out things like, what is their graduation rate? What is their employment rate? What is their bar passage rate? What you will find is that schools that are not accredited by the ABA, a lot of them, people start going to school there, they may even take out loans, and they don't end up a lawyer. either because they drop out, they don't pass the bar, they don't get a job. So that can be dangerous. So that said, this is what is required at ABA accredited law schools. You must get an LSAT score. I know we said we wouldn't talk about this, but let me talk about it for just 2 seconds. Some schools accept the GRE in lieu of the LSAT for a small number of applicants. So at those schools, you can apply without taking the LSAT. But again, it's just a few schools, and they set aside a small number of seats. So if you are going to go that route, you don't want to take the LSAT, you want to take the GRE, you're very much limiting where you can apply and also limiting your chances there. If you want to apply broadly to ABA accredited law schools, you need to take the LSAT. So I'm getting this question, and I think Katie can maybe answer it better. Will this be viewable after today? Yes. So Katie is responding. We are recording this webinar and we'll be sending out a copy in a few days. So yes. All right. So I did not answer that question. Okay. So an LSAT score, again, that is important. Transcripts from all undergraduate institutions before your first bachelor's degree. If you got another bachelor's, then it's not required to submit that stuff afterward, but you must submit transcripts for everything before you got your first bachelor's degree. This can be frustrating because sometimes people will, have taken like a community college class that they weren't serious about and they failed it. And that still ends up impacting your GPA. A resume, this I think is the easiest part of your application. Just put on it the stuff that is maybe not elsewhere in your application, but mostly I think what the resume is for them to just get a broad overview of what you've been doing with your life. So as long as it's consistent with everything else, that's fine. These last two things I think are very important, and they're things that you should start early. Your personal statement, like I was saying a little bit earlier in the presentation, you should do some research on the schools that you're interested in, and you can personalize, you can send different personal statements to different schools. I would do some research on each one of those schools and save a place in your personal statement, like a few sentences where you talk about how you would like to participate at that school, what programs, professors, extracurricular activities that you're interested in, and how you think your experience will be useful in those programs. Letters of recommendation, these you should start very early. If you've been out of law school, if you're still an undergraduate or it's been less than 5 years since you graduated, generally law schools are going to want 2 letters of recommendation from an academic source, ideally a professor, ideally one that has either graded your work, like a professor you've taken a class from, or an advisor. So let me just stop. I'm getting a few questions. Is it hard to work in a different state from the one you attend law school in? Can you go to law school in New York, in California, but then take the New York bar exam and work there? So let me answer this question. There's a fairly complicated answer to this question. If you go to, I don't want to use this term, a T14 law school or a top law school, then you can go anywhere. If you graduate from Yale, Yale is in New Haven, Connecticut, you can go anywhere in the country and tell them that you are a Yale trained attorney and you can get a job. There are other law schools where if you go to that law school, they're known as regional law schools. And those schools, it's going to be very hard to get a job outside of the market that law school is in initially. And so if you're going to one of those regional law schools, then you should plan to work in that market, take the bar exam of that state. You can go afterwards anywhere else. So, but it can be difficult. And what I mean by that is that the law is just like any other profession, where once you have worked for a few years, people are not looking at the name of your law school anymore. Instead, they're looking at your track record, your record of success. But what that means is that you may have to take one bar exam and then take another bar exam. Different bar exams can be harder or easier. And so if you are thinking about that, then I think it's important to look at it that way. Let's see here. Is a resume used for job search okay to use for the application process? I think it's fine. As long as there's nothing else that you want to put on there. You might want to modify it to, kind of pump up extracurricular activities. But I think that's fine. Let's see. Now the questions are coming in quickly. I was thinking about taking the LSAT-flex from home for college admission. I'm concerned that it will not be an acceptable substitution to the LSAT. So no. And rumor has it the LSAT-flex is easier. This is not true. The LSAT-flex is just as good as the LSAT. Law schools are not treating it any differently. People think the LSAT-flex is easier for this reason, and it's a misnomer. More people since the LSAT-flex came out with 170 plus scores have been applying to law schools. And so people are saying, aha, that means people are doing better on the LSAT-flex. But it's not necessarily the case that those people with the higher scores actually took the LSAT-flex. LSAT scores, generally, most schools will accept an LSAT score up to 5 years after you have taken it. So what happened, I think, during the coronavirus is not that the LSAT got easier, but the reason there were more applications of people with 170 plus scores is that people who had a good score in their back pocket decided to use it when they lost their jobs. And so more people applied with 170 plus scores, but that does not mean that the LSAT-flex is easier, and it is not. So I would not worry about taking the LSAT-flex. And in fact, June is the last LSAT-flex. After that, it's going to be a regular LSAT. It will still be at home, but then eventually next year, they'll bring it back. Here's a question. Can letters of recommendation come from a previous employer? I am retiring from the Navy after 22 years. Yes. If you've been out of law school, if you've been out of undergrad for more than 5 years, then definitely use previous employers. So I'm getting this question. How does this work for Canadian students that are willing to come back to Canada and practice law? I mean, I can tell you how to get into American law schools, and I know lots of people come to American law schools and go back to Canada to practice law there, but I do not know a lot about the Canadian legal system. So I'm afraid I can't answer that question. So one more, I'm getting the question, how can you tell that a law school is a regional law school? I would look at its ranking. I mean, if it's below maybe number 30 on US News and World Report, then it is probably what would be known as a regional law school. I know that's not a great way to look at it, but that's the way that hiring managers at big firms think about it. All right, so let's jump back in. Now I'm not sharing my screen anymore, so hold on one moment. One more question. Can you use an employer recommendation letter if you graduated less than 5 years? I would contact the schools that you're interested in applying to and ask them what their policy is. So you could submit them, but they might require academic references. So I would just check with the schools you want to go to. All right, share screens. Fantastic. Okay, we're almost done with this section. There are optional things that you can submit along with the stuff that is required. So other transcripts, a lot of times people won't do as well as an undergraduate because people are just younger and less responsible. And then they go and get a master's degree or something and they have a 4.0. You can submit that stuff. Law schools will look at it. They will find it important, but it is not required. An addendum is an extra essay that you write, generally to explain a bad fact in your application. These usually break down to either you got a semester of bad grades, or sometimes it's a criminal arrest or conviction that they will require you to explain. Sometimes they'll ask you something like, you know, do you have a criminal conviction on your record? And if you check yes, then an addendum becomes required. So you may have to write one of these addendums, even though it's under the optional. And then there's a diversity statement. Many schools will allow you to write an extra essay over and above your personal statement to show them how you would contribute to the diversity of the student body at that law school. If you're going to write one of these diversity statements, it can be on those categories of diversity that we generally consider, like race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, but it doesn't have to be on those. Instead, what they're asking for is how can you bring a unique perspective and set of experiences to this law school? I think most people don't need to write a diversity statement because for most people, well, not for most people, your personal statement should be a diversity statement in that it is showing how you will contribute uniquely to this law school. Unless you have some other argument that doesn't fit into the argument in your personal statement that you'll make a unique contribution, if your diversity statement is going to be redundant, with regard to your personal statement, don't write it. Only if you have something that doesn't fit into your personal statement that you can talk about should you take the time to write one of those. All right, so that is the application. At some point, you will have to complete all those things. The last thing I want to say about it is just the stuff that requires action from a third party, do earlier than you think you would have to. Things like letters of recommendation, especially, but just getting your transcripts from your undergraduate institutions. Anytime it takes a third party to take some action on your behalf, you will find that a lot of times they don't come in as quickly as you would like them to. So now, the last few things that we're going to talk about is how to prepare yourself for doing the actual work of law school. So we talked a little bit about what law school looks like. Now let's talk about the skills that are important in order to succeed in those things. And the skills that law school requires tend to be different than the skills that are required in other schools and in other professions. So lawyers do a lot of public speaking. Courtroom appearances are a kind of weird, stilted, rules-based acting that you do. And so you're improvising, but you're improvising according to the law, which can be weird and difficult, but the law is a public profession. People will watch you do it. And so once you become a lawyer, once you're arguing motions in front of a court and things like that, you'll be doing public speaking, but you're going to do it right out of the gate. When you get to law school, most of your classes or most of your professors will use the Socratic method. Some of them will be more aggressive with it. Some of them will be less aggressive with it. But what the Socratic method is, for those of you who don't know, is it's where your teacher, instead of just telling you how the law works, will ask you questions to force you to do the legal analysis yourself. And it will be done in front of your class. I've seen where one student, and sometimes classes are structured like this, where one student is talking for much of the class, sometimes even more than the professor. So public speaking is important. If you don't have experience with that, you might want to get some. Like I was talking about before, it's not just that you're speaking in public, you're doing something very particular. You tend to make arguments, and arguments about the law, which can be complicated and many-sided and a little bit convoluted. So having rhetoric and debate under your belt is helpful. If there is a speech and debate team at your undergraduate university, you might want to participate. That can be really, really useful for both public speaking and rhetoric and debate. Boring, I know, but a lot of what you're going to do in law school, and especially as a junior associate at the beginning of your career, is database research. The ones that you use most commonly in law school are Lexis and Westlaw. There are classes where you can use these databases, these particular ones, before you get to law school, that will help you hit the ground running. Because like I was talking about your legal research and writing class, you're going to do a lot of legal research. That's where you're going to do it. Lawyers write. Law students write. They write a lot. They write all the time. Being a good writer is critical to being a successful lawyer. There are a couple of things that lawyers do when they're writing, and I think I've got them kind of listed out here. One is what they call IRAC. So if you've taken, a pre-law class or something like that, you may have some experience with IRAC. But if you've heard about briefing cases, a lot of law school study is where you read cases and then you try to boil them down to what are the important parts of the case. The way you will do that, and the way lawyers generally do that, is the IRAC analysis. IRAC stands for issue, rule, application, sometimes people call it analysis, and conclusion. And it's where you figure out, okay, what is the issue being decided here? Often that's presented as a question in a particular case. What is the rule that helps us decide that issue? Often in doing legal research, figuring out which is the right rule to apply is a lot of what you're doing. And then that A part, analysis or application, that tends to be the bulk of a bit of legal writing that does IRAC analysis. And that's where you decide whether or not the rule that you're talking about actually applies in this case. A lot of that has to do with citing old cases that are on the same subject and deciding whether or not the facts of your case line up with that case, in which case the rule from that case may apply, or that it doesn't line up with the rule in that case, in which case that doesn't apply. And then your conclusion. So if you're writing a motion, your conclusion is that the judge should rule for you rather than for opposing counsel. So that's important, but that kind of technical writing is not the only thing that's important. I think creative writing actually helps too. And it helps in this way. Anytime you are writing a motion, part of what you are going to do, or likely part of what you're going to do, is a recitation of the facts in your case. And a lot of what lawyers do is arguing about how the law applies. But in order to get a favorable outcome from your client, you need to be able to characterize the facts in a way that is favorable to you, but also honest. You know, obviously you can't be dishonest about the facts. And so understanding how to tell a good story is actually important to lawyers, because that facts section, if you have the judge nodding along with you as to your interpretation of the facts, that can help you win the motion, even if the law is not as squarely on your side as you would hope it would be. So creative writing is helpful because lawyers tell stories. And especially when you get in front of a jury, that's a lot of what you do, is to tell stories. Citation, boy, this is boring. But when you are doing legal writing, it is important to make sure that the things that you are citing are cited in the proper way. When you get to law school, they're going to give you this maddening thing called the Blue Book that gives you these rules about how to cite cases and how to cite many other things as well. Down to what font size do you use? What is italicized as versus what is underlined? It's picky. I think it's kind of ridiculous, but it is something that, you know, some people are sticklers about. So understanding the rules of citation is helpful. These other things are things that you should be doing now, learning these skills now. And it's basically interpersonal skills. So a lot of law school, a lot of what lawyers do is interfacing with other people. Lawyers argue, but they also negotiate. And they build relationships. And this is, I think, a skill that's useful not just in law school, but everywhere. So networking, building relationships, both with potential employers, but also building academic relationships. It's important to build relationships with your professor as an undergraduate, not least because those professors are going to have to write you letters of recommendation. But when you get to law school, again, it's important to build relationships with professors. They will help your law school and legal career along the way. And then finally, interviewing. Like I was saying, law schools are very, or at least good law schools, are very aggressive at helping their students get jobs. Interviewing is a skill. You can learn to do it better. So it's a skill that's very important to law school. Before the end of your first year, you'll already be interviewing for that first, your 1L summer job. So what can you do in order to get these skills or to prepare yourself with law school? Several things. And these will prepare you for different things. So first of all, many law schools, and there are also private companies that do this, will offer what is commonly called a 0L course. And this is where they're preparing you for your 1L year. So they teach you a little bit about like what those doctrinal classes will look like and how to brief cases. They'll also teach you about that legal research and writing class and what is coming your way and how to prepare for it. So those can be helpful. And like I said, lots of times law schools themselves will offer those classes to students in the summer before 1L year, and often for free. We have, and this is a little bit different, but LSATMax has a 1L course. And so in order to prepare yourself for law school, this 1L course, like I was saying, 1L looks the same at just about every law school. It will lead you through the basic principles of those different courses. So having a look, and it's in the chat box now if you want to have a look at it, that 1L course can be very helpful for your first year. It's like a comprehensive study guide. But here are some other ways, at least to boil down, where do you want to go to school and where don't you? Campus visits. There might not be tours anymore at lots of campuses, but most campuses are still open. You can go walk around, get a feel for the campus. Reach out to student groups at the law schools you're interested in. There you're already starting to network with people, but you can get an idea of what that school is like. Is it really like you think it is? Does it, match your style? Some schools are more kind of competitive. Some schools are more collaborative. And so just talking to the people who are doing the work at the school you're interested in now can be very helpful. If you have not done this yet, do this now. Talk to your pre-law advisor. Almost every undergraduate institution has a person who works there, and their whole job is to help people decide on and go to law school. Get some information from that person, take up their time. You can also talk to generally a career counselor, especially if there is no pre-law program. They should have some information on that. So I'm getting a question, do you pick a major in law school? You can specialize, and some schools will offer a specialization on your degree. So for instance, at UCLA, there were a couple of them. There was an entertainment law specialization. There was, I think, a business law specialization. And I think there was also a law and philosophy specialization. But there is no major. For the most part, the way law school works after your first year is that you're just taking whatever classes you want to, with the exception of professional responsibility. Generally, that's a required class after your first year, and possibly constitutional law. So what you should do, or I think the way that you should schedule your classes after that, is to figure out to the best of your ability what area of law you want to practice in and take classes on that. And then also take classes on the other areas of the bar exam, because it's coming up, that are not taught to one else. So for instance, things like evidence, that's on the bar exam, but it's not taught to one else. But there really is not a major in law school specifically. So I'm getting a question about junior deferral programs. Are junior deferral programs evaluated the same as normal application cycle? What would you suggest for people applying to junior deferral programs in terms of building their resume? So my understanding is that with these junior deferral programs, and correct me if I'm wrong, you apply early, and then I think you take a year off and you're guaranteed admission down the road. I don't really know a lot about them. I don't think that you're necessarily, well, I mean, I think the idea behind it is that you're increasing your chances of getting into that law school by making it flexible for them to accept you. I don't know that there's anything different that I would do in terms of building my resume for the junior deferral program, because the stuff they want to see is the same that they will want to see later on. It's just you have kind of like a foreshortened schedule for doing that stuff. I wish I could answer your question better, but I think generally the things that are important to law school would still be the same. I hope that answered that question. So a few other things. You can attend LSAC forums and law school fairs. These used to be in person. Now, many of them are remote, but sometimes they will have an in-person component as well. At an LSAC forum or a law school fair, you can go and talk to representatives of the schools that you're interested in. People tend to want to use these as like a foot in the door. So I met your representative and now you should accept me to your law school. I think it's of limited value with things like that. But what I do think is very valuable is the information that you can get from those representatives. Be picky, be choosy. Is this the kind of law school you want to go to? Try to have an understanding of what you want out of law school, and then ask these representatives whether or not that's what you get at their law school. So again, I think they're useful, but they're useful for that reason. It's also, I think, important, and a lot of people don't do this, get some experience in just what the law looks like. Most court cases are actually open to the public. You can just go to a court. Again, with coronavirus pandemic, rules have changed, things might be different, but generally court proceedings are open to the public. You can go watch a criminal trial, you can go watch a civil trial. You can also often shadow or interview an attorney or judge. What job do you want? Go find the person who has that job and ask them about their job. Ask them about how they got there. I think those are great ways to prepare yourself. So all of those are things that you can do. I think they are very helpful. That's not all that you can do, but obviously it's a good start. So let's see. What advice do you have for those who are searching for volunteer job opportunities to enhance their resume but having a hard time? A lot of places have stopped volunteering and paused applications because of COVID. So this is, I think, a big difficulty right now, which is it used to be that you could, go work in an office. And a lot of places you can't go work in an office anymore. But I do think that there is an opportunity here in that a lot of places that would have hired people locally now are hiring people remotely. So I don't know that I have great advice for you other than to say generally broaden your search. You can now, even if you live in New York, you can have an internship in California and you can do it online. So I would just try to broaden my search, not necessarily your home region anymore, anywhere that you can find one. And if you're doing like international law, if you're interested in that, it doesn't even have to be a job in the US, ultimately. So I'm getting this question: are there any disadvantages one should be aware of if they decide to wait a year or two to apply to law school after having taken the LSAT? I do not think so. Like I said, law schools generally accept scores that are up to 5 years old, and I don't think they distinguish between a 1-year-old score and a 3-year-old score. If they do, I have never heard of that. So I think it's fine. I'm getting this comment, which is helpful. Indeed has a setting where you can look up virtual internships and volunteer opportunities nationally. In location, just put remote. There's also, and this one I think is a pay for service, but there's also Flex Jobs, which is all about remote jobs. And so you might want to look into that for remote volunteer opportunities as well. But that's very helpful. So go to Indeed and put remote. All right, that is our presentation. I hope it has been helpful. And again, I will answer questions. I see a number of them have been dropped into the Q&A box. I'll answer those in a moment. But let me just tell you very briefly about LSATMax before I do that. All of these course packages come with a payment plan. Studying for the LSAT is a big investment of time and resources. It pays off if you do it correctly, but we understand that it can be difficult to shell that out all at once. That's why we have those payment plans. LSATMax is a distance learning company. And so I want to tell you just a little bit about us and what I think separates us from the competition. So in this past year, I think a lot of people have learned that studying for the LSAT at home by yourself can be very difficult. And so we have been working on this problem for years because we are a distance learning company. And the way we address it is to try to make LSATMax a community of people studying for the LSAT together online. And we come about it in a couple of different ways. When you sign up for LSATMax, we're going to, you're going to tell us which exam you're studying for. And we're going to give you a calendar that starts about 4 months out from that test day. That will lead you through more than 100 hours of lesson videos. All of those lessons come with lots of real LSAT homework questions. A lot of them also come with drills and flashcards. The people who are studying for the same exam you are should be working through that calendar at about the same pace. And so they'll be working on those units around when you're working on those units. All of our videos and questions come with message boards. So you can ask a question if you're struggling with a concept or question. One of our 99th percentile instructors will answer your question. Students also collaborate on questions on those message boards. They're very heavily trafficked, so it's a great way to study collaboratively. We have weekly office hours, and in fact, in the month or so leading up to the exam, we tend to have daily office hours, which is a live session where one of our instructors will walk you through a common question type or concept and answer your questions about it. You'll get access to all 90 prep tests in the history of the exam. That is more practice than you could ever hope to complete. Our test day interface, or our interface, looks exactly like the test day interface, so you don't have to learn the mechanics of the exam as you're taking it. A few last things I want to point out: we're always tracking your performance with detailed analytics. This is especially important at the end of the course when you're cataloging your strengths and weaknesses, so your review can be both efficient and effective. All of these packages come with a free hour of private tutoring. These two bigger packages come with a higher score guarantee, meaning if you do not do better on test day than you did on your first practice exam, you can just send us your score report and we will give you your money back, no questions asked. Anyway, that is my pitch. Now let me answer your questions in the Q&A box. Where do specialty courses come in, like art law? Do you get to choose those classes starting in year 2? So art law, I do not know that you would end up specifically having an art law class, although you might, depending upon where you go to school. But art tends to fall under intellectual property. So most commonly, you would be studying that in a class about copyright law, although there are different types of intellectual property. There's also trademark and patent. But yes, you get to choose those classes starting in year 2. You would learn some of those principles in property law, because copyright is just about property that is intellectual, but you will learn a little bit about that. How important is an LSAT score if one has a high GPA and a demanding major? I wish I could tell you it is not important. I would be lying to you if I told you that. LSAT score is incredibly important, even if you have a high GPA. So the reason being, and I'll try to explain this in a brief manner, is that Law schools are required by the American Bar Association to disclose the GPA of the students they admit, as well as the LSAT score of the students they admit. The American Bar Association publishes that information, and rankings agencies like US News and World Report, for better or for worse, rely upon information like average LSAT score, median LSAT score. And so even if you are coming in to a school with a GPA that is above their median, if you come in with an LSAT score significantly below their median, then what that means is that to report that LSAT score is going to be harmful to that school. Because ultimately, if they report a lot of low LSAT scores, their ranking might go down. It's helpful if you are well above the median in a GPA, then I do think you can come in somewhat below the median in LSAT, but a low LSAT score can prevent you from getting into your preferred schools, even if you have an excellent GPA. All right, here's another one. I'm an undergraduate with a major in global management and a double minor in art history and the Arabic language. Does this field concentration inhibit me from other law school applicants? What I would say is that that sounds like an excellent package for law school. And I don't want to dismiss your question, but I think the subject matter of what you study as an undergrad is not terribly important. Law schools want to see not that you know about the law or that you've been doing a particular thing. They want to see what kind of person are you? Are you an analytical person? Are you a person who works very hard? Are you a responsible person? If your application package is checking those boxes, then I think it's a good application package. So all that said, I don't think it inhibits you at all. I think that's an excellent application package. All right, here's another one. Do schools weigh GPA according to your school's notoriety of course, difficulty, or rigor? Is that something admissions counselors are aware of, or should I explain a 3.55 GPA if on paper it puts me below the median? I would probably, well, what I would say is that law schools will think about how difficult your classes and your school are, and they will factor that in. But it only goes so far. And here's what I mean by that. Law school admissions is kind of a two-step process. They're going to have to disclose your GPA as calculated by LSAC to the American Bar Association. And so even though they don't have to agree that it's the same as a 3.55 somewhere else, those numbers are absolute that they report. And so in that sense, your 3.55 is probably not as good as a 3.8, even if that, the 3.8 was easier to get. So all of that said, yes, schools do weigh your GPA a little bit differently, but they're still looking at that overall number. So it will help a little bit, but not as much as you might think. Where does international and human rights law fall under? Well, if you're talking about in those 1L classes, human rights law, to the extent that you would be talking about that, would be constitutional law. International law, you probably won't get a lot of experience with as a 1L. And then if you're doing international human rights law, the US Constitution does not apply outside of the US. So those are things that generally you would be taking more specific classes in your 2 and 3L years. Most schools seem to want a letter of recommendation from a teacher professor. If I've been out of school for 5 years and have no connection to any former teachers, who would you recommend getting a letter from instead? Your employers, specifically supervisors if you can. It's okay to have colleagues as well that you've worked with, but it's good to have somebody who was responsible for reviewing your performance. But if you've been out of school for more than 5 years, most schools will accept those those professional letters. All right. For someone who is a sophomore in undergrad that decided to pursue law in this semester, what would you recommend to build up one's resume during their junior year that might demonstrate strong interest, make publications in creative writing journals, help as well as participation in mock trial? Yes, I think all of that stuff is good. I think creative writing is good, like we were talking about. A lot of what you do as a lawyer is presenting facts to people. You're telling stories. So I think that would be great. I think participating in mock trial would be great. I don't think any of the stuff that I talked about is different just because you're, deciding in your sophomore year. That's fairly early to decide. but I would just jump on the stuff that we have talked about. I know this question was made earlier in the presentation, so that might help. All right, let's see. This question, is it better not to call attention to 7 years experience in legal writing and research in bank law, state exec law, federal budget law? No, I would call attention to that. So I want to make the point here that I think legal experience is excellent, but I also think other experience is excellent. So I'm not trying to tell you not to get experience that is specifically related to the law. Do it. It's a good idea. But you can also use on your application information about your experiences that are not law related. All right, so I'm getting a question in the chat box. I have a diploma in immigration consultant and I am applying to work with the government. Oh, I'm not sure if that's a question. Here I'm getting the question, is GPA weighted less if you have been out of undergrad for 5+ years? I wish that were the case, but no. I think it gets the same weight no matter what. Would you, whoops. Brittany asked, would you recommend taking the GRE as well as the LSAT, or is just the LSAT okay? I would probably just take the LSAT. I mean, the GRE is a different exam, and all of the schools that accept GRE, you're applying for a small number of slots with the GRE, but they all accept the LSAT for the vast majority of the students they accept. So if you're just going to take one, definitely take the LSAT, as long as you're going to law school. Let's see. Should I attach my photo on my resume? I don't know. I mean, I don't think you have to. I don't know that it's a good or a bad idea. I wish I had an answer to that. I don't think law schools will care so much about the photo. So you can. Is it better to wait and take the LSAT in August instead of June if you are scoring in the low 160s, but your goal is to score in the 170s? I mean, I do think it's possible. So we're in kind of mid-April right now to move from a low 160s score to a low 170s score between now and June, I think is possible. I think it's more likely to happen between now and August than between now and June. What I would say is that many people take the LSAT more than once. And so I want to answer your question, but my best answer to your question is actually, I don't think you have to decide. Especially if you have not taken the LSAT yet, then I think it's perfectly fine to take it in June. Hopefully you get your target score. But if you don't, then you can just use it as a dry run for the next time. Law schools are only required to report one score for the students they admit. And so if you come to them with one low score and one high score, they're just going to focus on the high score anyway. So I think there's very little downside to taking the LSAT twice. All right. So I am currently an undergraduate. If I go from a 1.0 to a 3.7 in undergraduate, do they still look at my transcript, or is it more about the GPA? Well, I think they're going to see that trend line and they're going to be happy to see that trend line. I would be surprised that somebody could go from a 1.0 to a 3.7 because a 1.0 is very difficult to come back from. But again, your undergraduate GPA as calculated by LSAC, they will have to report to the American Bar Association. And so they don't have a lot of wiggle room for how they consider that GPA. They will look at the trend line and they will think that's important. But again, at the end of the day, there's a hard number they have to report. And so a lot of what they're doing is saying, is this a number that I want to report? If it's a 3.7, most schools will be happy with that, regardless of how you came to it. What are your thoughts on the impact of attending a law school with traditional grading versus non-traditional pass-fail grading on job prospects? I actually don't really know the answer to that question, other than to say it depends upon the firm that you're applying to. So if you're talking about like those big law firms, the Jones Days, the Morrison and Forresters, those law firms hire people with high grades out of competitive law schools. Even law schools that have pass-fail, like my sister went to UC Berkeley Law, they still ranked students. So she didn't have grades, but she was still ranked. And I think lots of law schools still do that. And so it's actually, I think, kind of less important because you're still being ranked. It's not like there's no way for employers to determine your performance. And I don't know, those big firms, they definitely hire out of Berkeley, which is a top 10 law school. So I think they do hire, but I think it depends more on the prestige than it does on the grading system, to tell you the truth. Let's see. Oh, this is a good one. Any tips on how to decide you really want to go to law school, especially considering the tuition? And how well do law schools work with students with disabilities? So the first one, how to decide you really want to go to law school, I think that's an easy question to answer. Get some experience to the extent that you know like what area of law you're interested in, get specific experience with that area of law and see whether or not you like it. The practice of law tends to be long hours. It can be combative and stressful. And so you just want to get an idea of if that's going to be the kind of life that you like. So I think getting some experience in a law firm, whether that's, an actual job, shadowing an attorney, something like that is great. How well do law schools work with students with disabilities? Any good law school will go a long way toward accommodating you. And in fact, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, requires them to do a lot to accommodate you. There's also other areas of federal law that impact how students are required to be accommodated. So without knowing your disability, it's hard for me to say, but what I would say is that most law schools are very keen on making sure that they're accommodating you. So I would probably not worry about that, but I would contact the schools I'm interested in and just ask them, what do you do to accommodate students with disabilities, specifically with, my set of disabilities? All right. Oh, we're getting some more questions over here in the chat box. Is LSAC having any more law school forums this year? I don't know the answer to that question, but since it's only April, I would think yes. They might not be in person. They're probably online. I seem to remember, again, I don't know their schedule, but I seem to remember them being like a couple of times a year. So this question asks, aren't the rest flex exams? The flex is through this June. It is still going to be an at-home exam after June, but they're bringing back the experimental section, and so they're not going to call it the flex anymore. So here's another question. I'm a non-traditional student who graduated with a BA in 2019. About 20 years prior to this, I did a year at one school and a year at another. Do I include these transcripts, and will this go toward my overall GPA? I'm guessing you want me to answer no, but I do believe the answer is yes, that you must include those, and I do think they will go to your overall GPA. Oh. All right. So let me answer this question. Let's see how we're doing on time. All right. If you have a below a 3.0, would you write an addendum? I don't want it to sound like an excuse because I have no real reasoning except for being young, but I'm not much older now. I do think it's important to write an addendum, and I don't think you have to be much older, but what you should do is in your addendum, explain how you have changed since then and what you do to make sure that you're not that sub 3.0 student anymore. Especially if you have a trend line where at the end of your college career, your grades started going up. I think that's helpful. But I would write an addendum. Don't excuse it, but do explain that you're not that type of person anymore. And people can change quickly. It's not like you need to be 40 years old to recognize your mistakes. Does the plan include any personal coaching on development of personal statement tailored specifically to each student's life career experience? I'm not sure which plan we're talking about. If you're asking, does LSATMax help with personal statement coaching? I believe we do. Maybe you can rephrase the question. How are gap years viewed by law schools? Any specific tips on navigating a gap year? I think gap years are looked at favorably to neutrally. If you're using that gap year to get some relevant experience, then it can be very helpful. What I would say is that you should just have some kind of place for them to understand what you have done with your gap year. If your gap year is you playing video games and drinking, then maybe a gap year is not great. But as long as a gap year has some work that you've done, and especially if it has work that you can talk about in your personal statement, I think it's great. Any specific tips on navigating a gap year? Try to use it to build your resume the ways that we were talking about. I don't know how to answer that one either. All right. What would be better, an average, below average GPA at a top law school or a high GPA at an average, smaller law school? Essentially, how marketable are smaller, lesser known law schools? It depends on what job you're looking for. So if you are going to go to one of those big law firms, then you need an above average GPA at a top law school. And I know that's not exactly answering the specific question you have asked, but it depends on what you want to do with your legal career. If you are interested in a particular area of law and working in a smaller market, and there's a law school in that smaller market that focuses on that area of law, then that may be a better law school for you than the big law firm. I wish I had a better answer for this question, but it depends upon what you want to do when you graduate. All right, let's see. For purposes of personal statements and law school applications, is it okay to admit that you are not sure about what area of law you want to practice? Or should you avoid admitting that? No, I think that's fine. You know, people go to law school really having very little idea of what the law is really like. And so I think it's helpful. Well, let me put it this way. I think it's helpful in putting together an application package to have some kind of broad idea of what your career looks like. Maybe it's as broad as, well, I know I want to help people. You can still do that. So I think you can still talk about what you want to do as a lawyer. The reason that I think it's helpful to have an idea of the area of law that you're going to practice is because in your personal statement, you can really give kind of like a story that starts from, you know, whatever the starting point is. It's probably somewhere, you know, in the past few years. And that tells the tale of how you're going to be a successful law school student and how you're going to represent this school as an attorney in a way that they would be proud of. The more that you can have an idea of what your career looks like, I think the easier it is to do that. But law schools expect people to come in and not understand what area of law they're interested in. They also expect people to change areas of law. You might be interested in criminal law and then decide mergers and acquisitions is your thing. So I think it can help in giving an overarching like goal for your application package, but it is not necessary. I don't know that you have to admit it in your personal statement. I just think if you're not talking about a particular area of law that you want to work in, just try to talk as best as you can about what kind of lawyer you would like to be. And again, if that's just as much as a lawyer who helps people, then I think that can be enough. So here's a question. I have a Bachelor of Art. Can I apply for law schools after the LSAT exam? Yes, I had a Bachelor's of Art too. Strangely enough, in philosophy, which is not an art. Most people who go to law school have a BA rather than a BS. Your major will never prevent you from going to law school. Law schools want to see that you have a degree. They generally do not care what area it's in because they're going to take you from a beginner and turn you into a lawyer. Let's see. Does being an untraditional student, college dropout to 4.0 valedictorian graduate lessen or increases my chances of admission with an average LSAT score? Well, part of that is going to decrease your chances. So, well, if you're a 4.0, then that's great. And I think the college dropout part actually doesn't matter because plenty of people, you know, kind of wander around life before they go to law school. Lots of people, in fact, end up in law school because they had a run-in with the law and they decided that after that run-in with the law, they wanted to go to law school. So all of that is to say that I think if you are 4.0 valedictorian, that's great. And your GPA, the better it is, will increase your chances of admission. If you have an average LSAT score, then that will put a cap on your chances of admission. So for instance, if by average you mean like 155 to 160, something like that, you will not be able to go to Yale or Harvard or Stanford with that score. It does not matter what the rest of your application package looks like. I think it's a great story to tell, though. So I don't think that college dropout part is a problem. And in fact, it's probably actually a good inciting incident for your personal statement. Can law schools see how many times you've taken the LSAT? Yes. And does it matter to law schools if you take it more than 2 times? A little bit. So law schools will see all of the times that you've taken the LSAT, whether you keep your score or you cancel your score, they will see all of those. I do think if you take the LSAT 3 times or more, it starts to raise red flags for law schools because it looks like you're having trouble identifying your weaknesses and accounting for them, and changing, like rolling with the punches. So I would probably try to take the LSAT 3 times or less if possible. 2 times or less is even better. Do you think schools will appreciate a positive trend line in GPA during the pandemic? Yes. And I think they'll appreciate a positive trend line no matter what. Because what law schools are looking for is to try to take what they understand about you now and to project that into the future to figure out what kind of students you're going to be. So if the trend line is good, if you're getting better at school, then they're going to look on that positively. Especially during the pandemic, I think that's great. They'll see it as being responsible. I feel like this might be the result of a misinterpretation. They only report the first undergrad. What if you have more than one? Well, I don't, if what you're talking about is undergraduate GPA, you must submit all of your transcripts before your first bachelor's degree. So that's not just the first undergrad, that's every transcript before you got your first undergraduate degree. After that, you don't have to submit what's left, but you can. If I have a lower GPA but get a high LSAT score, would that affect me negatively? Well, to a certain extent, yes. So like I had the same situation. I had a 3.3 GPA, which was not great, but I had a 175 LSAT score, which was a very good LSAT score. And I ended up getting waitlisted at UCLA and USC. And that my GPA, no matter what my LSAT score was, even if I got a 180, I would never get into a Yale or a Harvard. They just wouldn't accept it. So yes, it does. Your high LSAT score will help make up for it, but it will not perfect it. Let's see. Oh, geez. Do all lawyers become workaholics? How is family life balance? Most places where you go to be a lawyer, you will work hard. There are ways, I think, to manage your amount of work. Litigators tend to get drawn into trials, and when you're in trial, you'll work like 90 or 100 hours a week. So managing your life can be more difficult if you're doing litigation. If you're doing transactional law, things like entertainment law, sports law, real estate law, these tend to be more normal hours because you're not, preparing for trial, which can be a massive undertaking. It's also the case that it depends on what sector you work in. If you work at a private firm, you are more likely to work long hours than if you work at a government job or probably a public interest law. Family life balance is difficult. So I think that's something you have to think about and plan for before you become a lawyer. Let's see, we've got time for just a few more. So let me try to choose some questions that we have not covered. Oh, here's a good one that I can answer. When they bring the LSAT back with the experimental section, will it return to the original format that was composed of 50% logical reasoning and 25% analytical reasoning and 25% reading comprehension, rather than 1/3 of each? The answer to your question is no. So they're never bringing back that extra section of logical reasoning. It used to be before the coronavirus that there were 5 sections that you would get on test day. 4 of them were scored. Out of those 4 scored sections, 2 of them were logical reasoning, and you get 1 reading comp and 1 logic games. They have taken away one of those logical reasoning sections. It will never come back. Eventually, after starting this August, there will be an experimental section, which means you will have those 3 sections, 1 reading comp, 1 logic games, 1 logical reasoning, and then an extra one that will not count towards your score, where they're testing out questions to use on future exams. So the answer to that question is no, it's never going back to its original weight, which means logical reasoning is now less important than it used to be. Reading comp and games are now more important. All right, unfortunately, that's about all the questions we have time for. There are a few that are left open. So I'm sorry I didn't get to those, but I hope that today's presentation has been useful for you. Again, I want to thank all of you for coming out. I really appreciate all the questions. I'm really impressed by the participation. Obviously, this is a group of people who are really set on going to law school and understanding what the challenges are. So I think you guys, especially those of you who are still in today's presentation an hour and a half later, I'm really confident about what's coming up for you. So again, thank you so much for coming out. Don't forget, you've got that discount coming. So hopefully I will see some of you in the LSATMax universe soon. Take care. Bye-bye.